At its narrowest point, it's just 29 miles wide, but every single day it carries the weight of the global economy. Located between Iran and Oman, this narrow stretch of water handles roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day. That's about 20% of global demand. It's called the Strait of Hormuz, and in 2026 it has become one of the most important and fragile locations on the planet. Hi, my name is Titi. Welcome back to Titi Talks Energy, where we talk about all things energy. In this video, I'm going to break down from an engineer's point of view why this stretch of water has the potential to affect the global economy, spike petrol prices, and reshape energy carriers. Now, in process engineering, we talk about bottlenecks. These are basically points in the system where flow is restricted. We have too much coming in, but not enough space to get through. In global energy transportation across geographies, these bottlenecks are called choke points. They are narrow channels along sea routes that are critical to global energy security. This is because even a temporary closure of the choke point can restrict the flow of oil and gas. Let us imagine a 6-lane motorway that suddenly goes down to 1 lane. The cars used to plying that route have to queue up. The transportation time increases and prices go up. And if that 1 lane gets blocked, the damage becomes even worse. The world has a few major choke points: the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and the Bab el-Mandeb. But the Strait of Hormuz is very critical to energy transportation and security. Let's look at the numbers because they tell the story better than any headline. 20 million barrels of oil per day are transported through Hormuz. This represents about 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade. It means that 1 in every 4 barrels of oil shipped anywhere on the planet goes through here. And it's not just oil. The Strait of Hormuz also enables the passage of 20% of global LNG, which is liquefied natural gas. That's the fuel that heats homes in Europe, powers factories in Japan, and plays an important role in the future energy strategy of countries such as the UK and South Korea. Qatar, which is one of the world's biggest LNG exporters, ships virtually all of its gas through the Strait of Hormuz. There's also limited pipeline infrastructure to bypass the strait for oil producers like Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar. The strait is the only exit from the entire Persian Gulf, meaning that if oil tankers cannot leave through the strait, they do not leave at all. The countries most exposed to any disruption in the strait are primarily in Asia. China, for example, receives a third of its total oil through the strait. Japan imports 70% of its Middle Eastern oil via Hormuz. India and South Korea are very popular destinations for oil exports through the waterway, and so they are sensitive to supply disruptions. Europe is not left out. It also gets about 13% of its LNG from Qatar through the strait. So, what happens when it closes? So what actually happens when the transportation through the Strait of Hormuz faces disruptions? We are actually seeing this play out right now in 2026. Recent military escalation in the region has led to a drop in traffic through the strait by over 95%. Over 200 loaded tankers have sat stranded inside the Persian Gulf, unable to move. Major shipping companies have suspended operations, and within days, crude oil prices have surged past $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years, with predictions of prices about $200 per barrel if the closure persists. We are also seeing increased supply uncertainty and shipping insurance costs. In reality, there's more to this that is being covered by the news, especially from an engineering perspective. It's not just oil transportation that's in danger. The Gulf produces about a quarter of the global ammonia demand, a third of helium production, and half of the global seaborne sulfur, and 9% of the world's aluminium. So you see that the closure of the waterway is more than a crude oil and LNG transport challenge. There is a wider materials crisis, because when fertilizers can't move, it affects the food prices. When petrochemicals cannot move, plastic prices rise. When helium can't move, semiconductor factories slow down, and that means our phones, our cars, laptops, and even meals are affected by this all-important sea passage. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, has described the 2026 Hormuz crisis as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Now, when we hear 20 million barrels per day, it's easy to miss its magnitude. So let's try to put it into context. 1 barrel of oil is about 159 liters. So 20 million barrels is over 3 billion liters of oil every single day that pass through this single sea passage. If you try to move that by road using tanker trucks, each carrying about 30,000 liters, you will need over 100,000 trucks per day, one every 0.8 seconds, 24 hours a day. And that's before you even figure out where they will drive. This is why there's no quick fix. The scale of what passes through the Strait of Hormuz was not designed to be replaced, and it has evolved over 70 years of infrastructure decisions that are made assuming that the strait would always be open. Now, as engineers, we don't just ask what went wrong, we ask what are the alternatives. And there are three categories of alternatives to transportation through the strait. We have the bypass pipelines, strategic reserves, and rerouting. So let's talk through each of them. First of all, the bypass pipelines. There are really only two countries with operational pipeline infrastructure that bypasses the strait: Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline is 1,200 kilometers long. It runs from the eastern oil fields near the Persian Gulf all the way across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. This was built after the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the 1980s, specifically for this scenario. It currently has a capacity of up to 7 million barrels per day. The UAE's Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline links onshore fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, bypassing Hormuz entirely. It has the capacity to transport up to 1.8 million barrels per day. Iraq's largest crude oil export line is the Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline, which runs through to Turkey for onward export. But its southern fields, where most of the Iraq export crude comes from, have no pipeline connection to the north. So when Hormuz closes, over 90% of Iraq's crude oil production effectively has nowhere to go. Iran also built the Gore-Jask pipeline as an alternative transport route with a presumed capacity of 300,000 barrels per day. In reality, the total bypass capacity ranges from about 2.6 to 5.5 million barrels per day. If we compare that with 20 million barrels that normally flows through Hormuz, that still leaves a gap of 14 to 17 million barrels per day with no alternative route. It's a similarly stark situation for LNG. Qatar cannot pipe its gas to the world through an alternative route. LNG liquefaction terminals are fixed infrastructure that can't be easily relocated. So when Hormuz closes, that LNG supply is gone. Let's look at strategic petroleum reserves. This is where governments store up oil for emergencies, sort of like a battery storage for energy. The IEA member countries collectively hold about 1.2 billion barrels in strategic reserves. The US alone holds about 400 million barrels in its strategic petroleum reserve stored in underground salt caverns. In response to the 2026 Hormuz crisis, the IEA took the unprecedented step of authorizing the release of 400 million barrels. Comparing this to the 20 million barrels per day capacity of the strait, that's about 20 days supplies. So reserves buy time, but they don't solve the problem. Option 3, maritime rerouting around Africa. If you can't go through Hormuz, there's technically a shipping route that goes around Africa, the Cape of Good Hope route. It's the same route that European explorers used before the Suez Canal existed. The challenge with this option is that it adds thousands of miles to the journey and weeks of sailing time. That means higher costs and emissions, delayed supply, and significantly more tankers needed to maintain the same delivery volume. There are also proposed canal projects across the Arabian Peninsula that will create new routes. Some of these are estimated to cost hundreds of billions of dollars and are realistically going to take years of engineering design through to operation. So why does this matter to the rest of the world and the energy transition? When a choke point like Hormuz is disrupted, countries start to look for alternative suppliers. This creates opportunities for regions that are not dependent on that route. For example, Nigeria, Senegal, Mozambique, and Algeria are West and North African producers that can supply oil and gas without any dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. The challenge is that these countries have enormous gas reserves but lack the infrastructure to take advantage of extensive export opportunities. The pipelines, the LNG terminals, and the processing plants take years and billions of pounds to build. So when the world requires West African gas as an alternative, Nigeria cannot immediately take advantage of the opportunity. This is a pertinent engineering challenge. The energy transition isn't just about building solar panels, but also about building resilience into a system that is dependent on single points of failure of choke points and routes. Engineers working on pipeline design and construction, process safety and reliability are involved in building the redundancy that is required to make energy supply more reliable, resilient, and sustainable. The supply of energy through the Strait of Hormuz is a lesson in systems thinking. We can see the need to identify single points of failure and proactively build redundancy against disruptions in the choke points. Engineers designed this system, and the next generation of the engineers have to redesign it. That would include building new pipeline networks, designing better LNG storage, developing renewable systems that don't depend on shipping routes at all, and engineering the infrastructure for production and transportation of Nigeria's gas. As engineers, we solve the design challenges that geopolitics presents. How do you build energy systems that are resilient and not just efficient? How do you use choke points as an option instead of relying solely on them? How do you design infrastructure that can survive disruption at this scale? If you're interested in the engineering behind global energy systems, the energy transition, and what this means for your career, please subscribe to the channel and check out the other videos. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.